Good afternoon. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette University Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. And I want to welcome you to our On the Issues program, focusing on the Marquette Law Poll, specifically our statewide poll. Not much has happened since we last met, other than a debate, an assassination attempt, the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee, the announcement of Senator JD Vance as the Vice President candidate for the Republican Party. We've also had President Joe Biden state that he's not seeking re-election. We've had him also endorse Vice President Kamala Harris. We've seen her garner the Democratic nomination by virtual vote. And just yesterday, we learned that she has picked her vice president candidate in Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. So other than that, nothing's happened. But I'm also always joined by Dr. Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law Poll. Charles, hello.
Good morning.
Good. Well, actually, afternoon now. I'm going to go just a little run through of what we're going to do real quick. I'm going to give you the topics of the day. We're going to go over, as we normally do, the methodology of the poll. Many people ask questions about how the poll is conducted. We're going to go through the presidential matchups, and I've been asked, yes, this is going to have the matchup between former President Trump and Vice President Harris. We're going to go through the Senate race involving Tammy Baldwin and Eric Hovde, and we're going to go over those issues and candidate images, at least how they're seen through the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. And then we're going to talk about enthusiasm or lack thereof. So we'll get right into it. So, Charles, I'm going to ask you to start with the methodology. Could you go through the methodology?
Sure. Pause for just a second to mention that today is the 80th release of state polls. Tomorrow is the 21st national poll. So without anybody noticing it, we passed our 100th total polls. Thank you. Seems like just yesterday. So the survey was in the field July 24th to August 1st. We had planned to be in the field the week before, but with Biden's decision looming, not knowing what it would be, we pushed this back a week. Also, this is an extra bonus poll. We had not planned to do one here, but as Derek points out, a few developments made it nice to get a reading in here between the two conventions. We interviewed 877 registered voters. That's a margin of error of 4.6 percentage points. And there are 801 likely voters with a margin of error of 4.8. We focus a little more on the registered still, but starting next month, we'll start shifting to emphasizing likely voters a little bit more. Partisan makeup of the sample is pretty much in line with the usual. It's 31 Republican, 29 Democrat, 40 Independent. And our long-term average has been 30, 29, 40. So right on that long-term average. So that's the rundown of what we did and how we did it.
So tell me, how far are we out?
90 days.
So, everybody, can you tell us of this 90 days with all the things that have happened? How does the race look in Wisconsin?
You'll be shocked to learn it looks close. However, that's a change from how it looked 3 weeks ago. So what we have with registered voters is 49 for Harris, 50 for Trump. That's obviously inside the margin of error, is practically everything. But when we switch to likely voters, that flips to 50 for Harris, 49 for Trump. So yeah, pretty close. If we add in Biden, though, and ask how would you have voted if Biden had remained the candidate, then it's a 5-point Trump lead. So this is revealing, even though we didn't do a poll before he dropped out, of sort of where the race was. If you can remember back to June, the day before the debate, we had the race either tied or Biden up by 1 or 2. the polling average after the debate, not my polls, but all the other polls in the state, had shifted that to about a 3.5 point Trump lead. Here, asking people the hypothetical question, about a 5-point Trump lead seems plausible for that. But Harris, by replacing Biden, has really made up this deficit that had been created with Biden's problems with the debate.
Well, let me ask you this. Is that unusual that someone who's been in the race for 2 weeks to be garnering that kind of support?
It is a striking uptick. I think there are a couple of things going on. One is Democrats had been unenthusiastic about Biden all year. After the debate, a lack of enthusiasm, I think, turned to near depression. And when he made that decision, it opened the door to a fresh campaign without the things even before the debate, but certainly after the debate, that had been weighing down Democrats. So there was a very quick embrace of Harris. That, I think, was interesting. There had been talk about whether it should be an open convention or not, but the party obviously just really quickly coalesced around her. And that has boosted people's perceptions of her in terms of favorability. It's changed Democrats' view of how the race is going. And it sort of dwarfed or overshadowed the Republican convention, which is normally where you'd get a convention bump. There actually is a little bit of an uptick in favorability to Trump that we will get to, that I think is both the assassination attempt and the convention. But the big movement has been on the Democratic side with Harris stepping in.
Before we go any further, I neglected to mention when we started, we changed the format of this type of program. So if there are questions that you have during any point during our discussion, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll have someone come over with a microphone. We're going to have a microphone over to you real quick.
Do you feel that you are getting all the Trump voters? There isn't a shyness now, people to say that they support Trump. And how have you got away from the shyness?
From what? The shyness. The question was...
do you feel you're getting all the Trump voters? Or there are voters out there who are shy and don't want to say they're supporting Trump? And how do you get over the shyness?
And this, I'm not sure it's shyness. At least if you go to a Trump rally, there are not a lot of shy people there. They're maybe still in Minnesota with Garrison Keillor, but they're not shy at the Trump rally. What has been a problem, though, and I wouldn't use the word shyness, though it's widely used, is just a reluctance to talk to pollsters from Trump supporters. It's not that they're shy about it. It's just they don't want to have anything to do with the likes of me. And so we've made several changes to try to do better at reaching those folks. In the past, we divided the state into 5 geographic regions, made sure that we represented those 5 geographic regions accurately. Now we divide the state into 90 different regions, which are stratified by past partisan voting behavior, and we're making sure that we have the right number of people from every one of those 90 strata. So that doesn't guarantee that we're reaching reluctant to talk to a pollster voters, but it's the things that we've done to try to address those issues. And sometime in November, we'll know how well we did.
Oh, there's a question in the back.
So I've seen that you've used like likely voters versus registered voters. How did you determine that they were likely? Did you like ask them a question where they're like, I'm going to vote?
I'm going to repeat it real quick.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So the question is, on the poll, you noticed likely and registered voters. And the question is, how do you differentiate between those two types of voters?
Yeah. So as we've always done in our polling, we ask people, how certain are you that you'll vote in November? Are you absolutely certain, pretty likely to vote, 50-50, or there's a chance you won't vote? We use the people who say they're absolutely certain to vote as the definition of likely. Now, of course, that may leave out some people that are pretty likely and will in fact vote. This year, because we're now sampling from the voter registration list instead of random phone numbers, we can compare the answers to that question with the person's history of voting since 2000. In the 2000, in the primary, in 22, and in the primary. It turns out if you measure it that way based on how people have actually voted in the past, you get a slightly different group of people who would be called likely. But if you run the numbers with our definition and with the past voting behavior definition, the differences are different by tenths of a percentage point. So it really doesn't make a practical difference which measure we use. So we're sticking with the subjective measure in the sense that deciding to vote is an attitude that can change. Your past voting behavior is informative, but it doesn't tell you quite as much about this fall.
There's a question right there. Can you keep your hand up, please? Oh, we got you.
Before each poll, do you update your bank of registered voters to reflect changes in that?
Sure.
Or how frequently does that occur?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm going to cut you off real quick.
Okay.
Before each poll, the question is, before each poll, do you update the bank of people that they get the information from?
Yeah, it's continuously updated. As you know, obviously there's a little bit of a delay between the submission of the registration and getting processed. We do also ask people if they're on the phone, if they're not registered, are they sure they're going to register? But that's much less because we're sampling from the voter list now. We still do have some people who aren't on the voter list that we reach anyway, but that's a smaller percentage. And that's the one disadvantage of the voter list. It will be updated right up to our final pre-election poll, but there's going to be a little bit of slippage, and with Election Day registration, you run the risk of missing some of those folks.
Is this the first time Donald Trump has polled at 50% in any of your polls?
The question was, is this the first time that Donald Trump has polled at 50%?
No, we've seen 50-50 ties before. He's been up by 2 points, and I can't recall offhand. I think that was 51-49. So close. Now remember, on this question, we are asking undecided voters, if you had to choose, how would you vote? So there are still, on the first question, 8% or so who say they haven't decided. Then we follow up with if you had to choose. So neither of them would be above 50% on that first question, but with the if you had to choose, you got to get to very close to 100% total.
Shall.
Charles, what do you think are the important elements that have changed this election to give Kamala? Kamala has a 1% lead, right?
It's either she's trailing by 1, leading by 1, or leading by 2. Take your pick.
What specifically do you think has changed?
I'm going to get to that in a few minutes when we look at how things have changed from last time to this time. Personality is clearly different, and when we get to personal traits, she is viewed differently than the way Biden was viewed, and that's important. Issues don't seem to have changed much, but let me postpone that until we get to that point. And then the biggest thing is enthusiasm, which has changed so much among Democrats, which we'll also get to.
Okay.
It'll be short, promise. So your vote is private until you cast it, and then it's available for pollsters?
No, not at all. Let me be clear about that. Your vote is never known by anybody. That is absolutely right. But that you registered to vote is a public record. And if you voted in an election, that's a public record, but not how you voted in that election. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move on because we've talked about, we've done this for the last couple of polls. Could you break down the other candidates in addition?
So when we get to, there are at this point, I believe, the deadline for submitting nomination or ballot papers was this week. So West and I believe Kennedy submitted those papers, so that's not yet certain. But we also have the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and the Constitution Party all already on the ballot. So we asked this multi-way 7 candidate race. And basically what you see is this is where Harris leads by 2. I mentioned that a moment ago, either down by 1, up by 1, or in this slide up by 2. Kennedy at 8% is notable because he started at 16, fell to 13, was at 8 in June, and is 8 again now. All of the others, Oliver and Stein, managed to make it up to 1%, in one of those cases rounding up to 1%. And Terry and West, Terry's the Constitution Party, fall below 0.5%, which is why that rounds down to 0 on these. So it doesn't change the order between Harris and Trump. Kennedy is still getting a non-trivial share. In 2016, all the third-party candidates together got 5.5% of the vote here. And so you can see here that at 10% total, that would be nearly double what we saw in 16. In 2020, though, it fell to just 1.5% for third parties. So the big question for the next 90 days is, does this third-party support continue now that Biden's out of the race and Harris is in, and exceed even 2016 levels of third-party voting? Or with the change in candidates and the seriousness of the close race here, does third-party support continue to dwindle? It didn't drop from June till now for Kennedy. That was 8 and 8. So that's the bit of a change there.
So we're going to go into more detail on the presidential, but real quick, can we just jump to the Senate race?
Yes, because this one's also pretty important. Here, Baldwin is keeping the lead that she's had throughout the time since Hovde got in the race. She's leading by 7 now, 53-46. Again, this is if you're undecided, who would you vote for if you had to choose? And that's registered voters by 7. If we switch to likely voters, it's a shade closer, 5-point race, 52-47. But if we go back to that first question that allows people to say they're undecided, it's 14% who initially say they're undecided. Baldwin has a larger 8-point lead of those that give an answer, but 14 undecided is still a fairly substantial undecided rate there. I think in the shadow of this summer and a few of the events that Derek mentioned, it's not surprising that people aren't focused in on the Senate race. Also, the lack of a competitive primary in the Senate race has probably kept attention a little bit away from that. Where did I go? Among likely voters, it's a little bit lower undecided, 10% undecided. But then we actually have third-party candidates in the Senate race. Phil Anderson is running under a new party name, Disrupt the Corruption, I think it is. And Leaguer is running under the America First party line. They're both on the ballot, so again, these are going to be on there in the fall. And they get 2% each in the Senate race. But Baldwin leads by 6 when you include those third-party candidates.
All right, so jumping back to the presidential, amongst Democrats, how do they feel about Harris as the nominee?
Yeah, this is what we were talking about to Shell's question about how has opinion shifted. And the bottom line is Democrats are pretty satisfied with Harris as the nominee. So now this is only among Democrats. It's certainly lower when you include independents and Republicans. But 92% in our survey, and remember, we started just 3 days after Biden dropped out, though a lot of people were interviewed through that week and the next week. But the party really did coalesce very quickly around her, only 7% saying they're less than satisfied and 1% who don't know.
And I know that you took that same question to JD Vance.
Yeah, with Vance, a slightly different wording. We asked, how would you rate Trump's selection of Vance as vice president? Again, this is only with Republicans now that we're looking at. And they're pretty satisfied, or 32% say it's an excellent choice, 45% say good. So that puts us up to 77% of Republicans who rate that as an excellent or good choice. But 7% say fair, 8% poor, and 8% don't know. So there is some lack of satisfaction with him or lower ratings for him. But with all of the emphasis on Vance and some of his past statements, that tends to overlook the fact that among Republicans, this is seen as a pretty good choice.
Now, this next slide is the one that's most important to me because I'm intrigued by it, because you have the head-to-head matchup between Harris and Trump. But if you ask voters who they think are going to win, that changes that dynamic.
Trump. 51% say Trump is definitely or probably going to win. 38% say Harris is definitely or probably going to win. So even though the race is incredibly close in terms of people's voting preferences, the perception that Trump has an advantage going into the fall still remains. And
did you do that same thing with Biden and Trump?
I did do the same thing with Biden. Yeah, and this is, again, hypothetical. If Biden had stayed in, who do you think would have won? Only 20% think Biden would have won, 69% Trump. So again, talking to Shell's point about the dynamics of the campaign, this sort of pessimism about the race with Trump as the nominee against Biden, which we saw kind of reach its peak around the RNC in the aftermath of the debate, but before Biden drops out, really did create a public view that this race was very unlikely to go to the Democrats. Now with Harris, people still think Trump has an advantage to win, but it's not as lopsided as it was with Biden, clearly.
Oh. There we go.
Does this question only apply to Wisconsin? We're talking about on a national...
Now, the question says who's going to win the election in November. So it's about the national winner rather than who do you think will win Wisconsin. Good point. Okay?
Yep. All right, so in light of the statistic that you see there on the screen, the next question you ask is, should Biden have withdrawn in the first place?
And yes, he should have. 79%. Now, this is for all registered voters, not just among Democrats. Only 15% say he should have stayed in the race. A fair number of those are Republicans who wish he had stayed in the race. But it's basically bipartisan. 79% for everybody. It's only a little bit into the 80s among Democrats. So, and Republicans and independents are also quite high. So this really was a consensus view that he should have gotten out, with Democrats just a little more happy that he got out than others.
Now, one of the talking points after he's withdrew had to do with whether or not he should resign from the position as president.
Right. And here, most people say no. 58% say no, he should not resign the presidency before the end of his term. 33% say he should, and 9% say they don't know. So not not any indication that there's a building majority for him to resign.
Okay. All right, here's the part that we talked about earlier when I first started in regards to the candidate images, how we feel about them, what we think about them.
Yeah, and this is where, to take Shell's point, this is where the biggest dynamic can come from, because you replace one person with a different person, just on the face of it, that would have some impact. But there are considerable differences in history, biography, dare I say, age, between Biden and Harris, and all of those show up when we ask this. We ask people to take 6 phrases and say, how well does this describe Kamala Harris? How well does it describe Donald Trump and Joe Biden? And so what we see is the first one at the top is too old to be president. When Biden was the person, that was 76% in June before the debate that said he was too old to be president. With Harris, that's just 12%.
To me, that seems kind of high.
Well,
someone in their 50s is too old to. I feel attacked here.
Yeah, I'm blaming the 18-year-olds, but I don't know. Didn't run that analysis to see who thinks she's too old. But it's not, compared to 76%, this is obviously not an issue for her. But it flips the script, because 59% say Trump is too old to be president. And so Trump, in this comparison, Trump has gone from the not quite so old guy who didn't have as much of a problem to now clearly being much more perceived as too old compared to Harris. So that is one of the fundamental changes that going from Biden to Harris, and age is pretty consistent, right? It tends to go up by 1 year every year. And so that's not going to change in chronological terms. Does Trump's age become an issue for him, though, the way it became an issue for Biden, again, even before the debate? That I don't think we're quite as sure of right now, but certainly just the image of her versus him is quite different there. I'm just going to go down them on the list here. Shares your values. 51 say that applies to Harris. 46 say it describes Trump. So not much difference there. But with Biden, it was 46-46. That's using Biden from June, the last time we asked this about Biden. And so what was essentially an even match is just slightly better for Harris by just 5 points, but a little bit. Has behaved corruptly. This is Trump's biggest burden at 62%, saying that he's behaved corruptly. Only 37% say that applies to Harris. With Biden and the complications and the criticisms due to Hunter Biden, with Biden that was in the mid-40s. So with Harris going from the mid-40s to 37 is a relative improvement on that issue for her versus Biden. And for Trump, it's at least as bad as it has always been, maybe a shade higher now. Has strong accomplishments. This has been Trump's stronger suit, and Biden was running in the mid-40s on accomplishments while Trump was running in the low to mid-50s. He's at 54 now. Harris is at 44. So advantage Trump on this, maybe slightly less of a disadvantage for Harris compared to Biden's low accomplishment numbers. Has the right temperament. Now, this is where Biden had a 52% saying he had the right temperament. With Harris, that goes up to 56. And for Trump, it's a low 42. That's unchanged from June. So, again, a little bit better for Harris, but on a trait where Trump was at a disadvantage all along. And finally, strong leader, which this is the first time we've asked that question, so we don't have a comparison for Biden. But at the convention and in Trump's speeches, he has made a big point of criticizing Biden as a weak leader, not respected by world leaders, and so on. And he ends up with 58% that say he's a strong leader. And for Biden, that was down in the low to mid 40s. But with Harris, it's a 50-50 split on that, which is a little surprising given she's just stepping into this. But she's not at as big a disadvantage on this as, I'm sorry, I misspoke. We have not measured this before for Biden, so there isn't a past measure for him. But with Harris, she at least starts out in shouting distance on this one. The upshot of this is, if we just summarize them, in June, there were 2 of these comparisons that favored Trump, 2 that favored Biden, and on the 5th one, it was essentially a toss-up. Right now, I would say there are 3 that favor Harris, 2 that favor Trump, and 1 that's essentially a toss-up. So there's been not a dramatic shift, but a little bit of shift on the balance, but of course a big shift on age and a more favorable comparison for Harris on the corruption question.
And our next slide, we break it all down, different issues and how they stand on each issue. And this is Wisconsin only.
Yeah. And this is where things haven't changed so much, though there is a little bit that we'll talk about. So the issues that Trump has the biggest advantage on are up at the top. The first is immigration and the border. The second is the Israel-Hamas war. And the third is the economy. On all of those, he's had an advantage over Biden all year, and he maintains those advantages over Harris now that she's the candidate. On handling foreign relations, Trump has had this very small 2 or 3 point advantage. He still has a 3-point advantage here, but that one's quite tight, certainly compared to Israel or the border and the economy. But then we get to the issues that Harris has an advantage on: handling Medicare and Social Security, then ensuring fair and accurate elections, health care, and finally abortion policy. Her advantages on these issues look a little bit bigger than Biden's advantages were on the same issue. In other words, people see a little bit more of a difference, a little bit more of an advantage for Harris on each of these 4 compared to Biden. They're not huge differences, but this is one way that the issues might not flip dramatically, but the margins between the candidates might start to develop as we go through the campaign.
What are the most important issues to residents of Wisconsin?
These have changed just slightly. The economy remains overwhelmingly the biggest at 38%, saying it's the most important issue for them. Immigration and border security had been number 2, but it has slipped by just 1 point into 3rd place, with abortion policy now rising to 2nd place. Immigration at 1 point behind at 13%. Then a bit of a drop into single digits with Medicare and Social Security, and then the rest are in mid to low single digits. Foreign relations and the Israel-Hamas war notably at the bottom on these. So this is a little bit of movement. I think the one thing I would highlight is that immigration as an issue seems to be falling in terms of how important people rate it over the last several months. It's still 2nd or now 3rd place, but not quite as high. It was in the upper teens or near 20 in earlier polls.
And you've broken that down by party.
Yep, because the party agendas really are quite different. With Democrats up at the top, abortion stands out as the number 1 issue with 26%. Then Medicare and Social Security is 2nd, closely followed by the economy. And then you drop off with health care and some of the other issues. That's been true all year, that Democrats have put abortion number 1, but the economy sometimes 2nd, now barely 3rd place. Independents really only have the economy as an issue. Everything else is down in single digits, and not much differences among those. You see several tied at 3%, one at 9%. Finally, with Republicans, it's the economy and immigration, and you see 25% of Republicans putting immigration most important. The things that are discrepant between the parties are most clearly, for Democrats, immigration is just 1% saying that's their most important issue, whereas for abortion, that's just 5% of Republicans. So there are differences on those issues between the parties.
Which is interesting because you see when you watch TV, you see commercials, and immigration seems to be the issue you see the most, but it seems like it's sort of dropping in the polling.
I think it clearly has come down a bit in the polls as how important it is. What people want to do with immigration is another question that we've been asking about, and particularly deportation, but we'll get to that a little later.
He's got a mic right behind you.
Several of those questions that we have covered, including this, have a lot to do with a matter of opinion rather than a basis of the facts. Mm-hmm. For example, when you ask somebody, are you sure you're going to vote this way or that way? That's almost a factual number. A lot of these are a matter of opinion. For example, the economy. I think most of us understand that the economy has been actually fantastic with all of the statistical figures that we have. In fact, we had some record low unemployments going back for 50 years. If that doesn't show you what the economy is doing, I don't know what does. Yeah. Okay. However, we quickly forgot that every month after month during Trump administrations, we were losing 750,000 jobs each month, 1 month after another. And although partially due to COVID, economy came to a standstill. And yet Trump is saying that the economy is bad now, and everybody believes it because of the advertising. The same issue we had with the matter of who is the stronger in one way or the other, the previous slide. Every one of those, if you use the statistics to measure who's doing better, they're a lot closer or Trump would lose. Yeah. But the impression is that the Trump was so successful.
I think the argument between what the statistics for employment and so on show, or real income, versus people's perceptions or feelings about those are pretty discrepant. And they're enormously discrepant if you divide them by party. Democrats right now think the economy is humming along. Republicans are convinced we're in a recession, if not a depression. And independents are pretty much more like Republicans than Democrats. So, the question is, do you think those objective numbers drive the vote or the subjective feelings drive the vote? Here, we're not asking what is it about the economy that you think is a problem. We're just letting people tell us if they think that's a problem. It's a topic for a deep dive, but we don't have the space in the survey to try to tease all of that out. I will get to how people feel about their circumstances in just a minute.
I didn't see any mention in the issues of gun violence or climate change.
Right. These are things that we have asked about in the past. We haven't included them in this set of issues, but one of the things we find is, and we did this a lot in 2022, is a huge difference between the people who say that gun violence is a problem and the people who say that crime is a problem. Those are very partisan divisions, with Democrats saying gun violence is the problem, Republicans saying crime is the problem. We could reintroduce these because Trump in his stump speeches certainly includes crime and fear of crime as an element of his campaigns, but we haven't included it at this point. Climate change is one of those where a lot of people say it's important to them, but it tends to be sort of, a very partisan issue to state a position on, with Democrats emphasizing it, Republicans not. Hasn't been, I would say, central to the campaign, though there's certainly elements of it. Trump's criticisms of electric vehicles and renewables, for example.
And I remember you mentioned in a prior poll that specifically about climate change, that you referred to younger voters making it a bigger issue than older voters.
Yeah, I should answer one more thing on this. Younger voters definitely more concerned about climate change. I'm guided in this in other polls that ask open-ended questions. We're giving you these 7 or 8 issues. How do you feel about them? But in other polls, they say, what is the most important problem for you? And then they just code those open-ended answers. And so I'm picking the ones from the top of that list of what people spontaneously mention. So that's the other thing that's guided why I settled on these particular issues.
All right, so we talked about the candidates, we talked about their issues. How's the enthusiasm as regards to the polling in the past?
Looking up. So the very top bar is this poll. 61% now say they're very enthusiastic. In June, it was just 46%. And it had been in that mid to upper 40s all year long. The bottom bar is August of 2020, when it was 62%. So until this poll, all of our polling this year had been 15 to 20 points lower than the comparable poll in 2020. But this time it's bumped up to virtually the same, 61 versus 62. So this is just the direct evidence of how much enthusiasm changed. And again, this is not enthusiasm for your candidate. It's a question of how enthusiastic are you to vote in this fall's elections. So a big change that's taken place here.
So now you're going to break it down to the candidates.
Yeah. And it had real partisan consequences because if we look here at, Harris versus Trump on enthusiasm. So among those who are very enthusiastic about voting, Trump has a small lead, 52-47. But he led with over 60% in this group against Biden in June. So this group, which was an overwhelmingly large Trump advantage in June, is now a very small Trump advantage. And it's not because people changed their minds about who they were voting for. It's because they changed their level of enthusiasm. There are now a lot more very enthusiastic Democrats, and that equalizes the vote. Harris has a tiny lead in the somewhat enthusiastic, just 1 point. That's where Biden had a bigger lead last time. And then in the other two, not too enthusiastic and not at all enthusiastic, Harris has substantial leads, as Biden had substantial leads in those groups as well. So I think the big change has come at the top end of the scale. What I told you in June was that this was a real warning sign for Democrats that low enthusiasm could result in lower turnout. That could affect the Senate race. It could affect the legislative races around the state. Now we're seeing nearly equal levels of enthusiasm within Republicans and Democrats. Republicans have a small edge still, but it's a very small edge. And the consequence is we're now not seeing that big gradient that we were seeing with Trump support at the top, Biden support at the bottom. Now it's close at the top and a bit of a Democratic edge towards the less enthusiastic.
So what has changed in regards to the favorability of all these candidates?
Not as much as the personalities have changed, and we still don't like any of them. I don't know what I'll do if somebody becomes popular. I won't be able to use that line again and again and again. For Harris, her net favorability at the top is minus 12 points, 41 to 53. We haven't measured her recently, but in 2022, when we last asked about her, she was at 36% favorable, so about a 5-point increase compared to where she was that last time, though we don't know what she was in the spring. Trump at minus 10 and also Vance at minus 10. Slightly less unfavorable than Harris, but Biden at minus 17, that was one of the developing things over the winter and spring. that at one point a year and a half ago, Trump was at minus 36. And over this last 18 to 20 months has climbed to this not bad minus 10, not bad by contemporary standards, but certainly not bad compared to minus 36. Biden had been underwater, but underwater by 8 to 10, and that grew all the way to the minus 17 you see now. So those have been shifts, but they've been shifts over the long haul, not just real briefly. Trump did pick up about 3 points in favorability from June to this poll, so the convention, the assassination attempt may have had some effects there. Harris's bump up, again, with a longer time frame, is 5 points, not a huge bump there either, but both in a positive direction. And then when you get to the other third-party candidates, you get Kennedy at minus 18, and with 26% still saying they don't have an opinion. And for Stein, West, and the Libertarian Chase Oliver, it's over 65% or more that don't have opinions of them. These are not very visible candidates.
How about the matchup between Biden and Trump in favorability?
Well, this is the so-called double haters, the people that don't like either one of them. That's the brown bar at the bottom. In this sample, 14% don't like either one of them. But in June, it was 17% that didn't like either one. So a small lessening of the double haters here. Notice also that there is slightly more, 42% that like Trump but not Biden, and 39% that like Biden but not Trump. In the winter, those numbers were reversed with more people liking Biden and not Trump. But again, over the spring and summer, those flipped to a small Trump advantage. When we add Harris into the mix, though, it goes down to 11% that dislike both Harris and Trump. So again, we don't have a comparison of her with Trump from June. But if we use Biden's as a benchmark at 17, this looks lower. And Trump still has a smidgen of an advantage, 41 like him and not her, 40 like her and not him. But that's obviously really, really close, a little tighter than it was with Biden. I should just mention that about 6% say they don't know enough about Harris to have an opinion yet. So how those new opinions get formed between now and the Democratic convention in a couple of weeks and then into the fall, we could see some shifting as new opinions form, either pro or anti towards Harris.
Can we go into the Baldwin-Hovde race in regards to favorability?
Yeah. And Tammy Baldwin at a net 0 is more popular than those folks in the negative range in the presidential race. But at a 44-44, favorable, unfavorable, 12 don't have an opinion. Hovde's at minus 13, 24 favorable, 37 not favorable, and 38 without an opinion. We'll say more about that in a second. Here's Baldwin's favorability over time, starting at June a year ago at the bottom. She's been a little positive, a little negative, a little positive, slightly positive, and now dead even. There's not a lot of trend there, a little bit of bouncing around, but pretty close. Also, June a year ago, 22% didn't have an opinion of her. That's dropped to the low teens, 11 or 12% this time. Still some that don't have an opinion, but less than a year ago. But when we go to Hovde, the big story here is the gray bars, because June a year ago, 85% say they didn't know enough to have an opinion. You can see that go down to 82, and then 56, and 44, and now 38. So people are becoming acquainted, beginning to form opinions of him. On the not so good side for him, his unfavorables have gone up a little bit more than his favorables have gone up. So if you look at just the last three, his favorables have gone from 19 to 23 to 24, while the unfavorables have gone from 24 to 32 to 37. So far, people making his acquaintance have been more likely to form unfavorable views, especially if you think about everything that's happened this summer. the Senate race really has been kind of lost in the turmoil at the presidential level. Once we get through the primary and get through the DNC, I think we'll see the Senate race fully engaged. It'll still be in the shadow of the presidential, of course. But I think this gives us a good way of looking at how the race has developed so far. But I don't want to pretend that the real race for the Senate hasn't taken hold yet. I don't think it's taken hold yet. It will take hold soon, and people will tune in more.
There appears to be some good news for Biden since he left the race.
A little bit. A small uptick in approval, job approval. It's not a big boost, and he's still way down in the mid-40s. But it is the first time his job approval numbers have ticked up in living memory. I exaggerate slightly, but it has generally been, for the last year and a half or more since 2022, a slow but steady decline from sort of the mid-40s to the high 30s. A little bit of an upturn this time. Obviously, in one sense, it doesn't matter. He's not the candidate anymore. On the other hand, the images of the administration might play some role in the fall election as well. So a small improvement for him. We also ask people to think back about when Trump was president, and do you approve or disapprove of the job he did when he was president? And that also took a small uptick last month. In the high 40s with approve, low 50s of disapprove. That's actually very close to where it was in October of 2020 when it was 48 approve, 52 disapprove. He's very close to that number now. So there's been some talk about a rosy recollection. It's actually not rosier than it was, but it's not worse than it was either at the end of the 2020 campaign.
How about the view of the national economy?
Yeah, so this goes to the perceptions of the economy. There's been a bit of a rise in the percent saying the economy is poor. That's the dark purple line here. If you look at the very bottom in November, it was 37, and then it dipped down to 28, and it stayed at 28 in April. But it ticked up to 32, and now this month up to 33. So it's not a massive shift, but there is a little bit of a shift in that at the lowest end of perceptions of the economy. We're at 33% that say it's excellent or good. It was 34 last time, 33 before that, 38 before that, 29 before that, 27 before that. So not really any trend in the upside, kind of flat. A little bit of an increase in the perception of a poor economy. Our poll was completed before the tick down in the stock market a couple of days ago, so that didn't affect these results at all. But we also asked people about how their personal family finances are. So this is not about the global economy, but how are your family's finances right now? This time, 44% say they're living comfortably, but 40% say they're just getting by, and 15% say they're struggling. And here, there's the smallest of downward trends in the living comfortably. Last fall and during the winter, it was 48 and 49. Now it's 46 and 44. Not much, but a little bit of a downturn. And the struggling side has gone up maybe a little bit from 15 or 13 to 15 and 17 last month, but now down to 15 this month. So more people sort of in that just getting by category. And to put a comparison, in 2019, before the pandemic, we were seeing the living comfortably up in the mid-50s. So by comparison to that pre-pandemic level, fewer people say they're living comfortably now than were at that point.
Before we go any further, any questions on that information?
I've heard it said that Wisconsin's a battleground state because we have such a high voter turnout. Is that true, and what is our voter turnout?
Our voter turnout is typically in the top 3 in the country. We often fight with Minnesota and Iowa and sometimes New Hampshire for the number 1 spot. But we are eternally right up there at the very top in the country, year in and year out, not just 1 year. We saw record turnout in 2020. The one thing that we saw in 2022, though, was a little bit of a decline compared to the 2018 turnout. Turnout in midterms is always lower than presidential, but it had been going up year after year after year in midterms since about 2010. But in 2022, it dipped down a little bit, which I think is one question about whether 2024 is going to be another record-setting turnout or whether 22 was kind of a harbinger that even with a hot governor and Senate race that year, we didn't turn out quite the levels we did in 18. But high turnout, sure. Super high turnout, probably, but maybe take 22 as a small warning sign. What also has happened is we remain, as you saw early in the slides, we're so evenly divided in partisanship, a 1 or 2 point Republican edge in party identification. And we've also seen a lot of change in the state, but that change has been offsetting. So the Southeast has become less Republican, but the Northwest has become more Republican. So even though those 2 regions look quite different now than they did even just 12 years ago, the balance has remained. It's almost like there's an equal and opposite law here, that one side goes one way and the other part of the state goes the other. So that's been maintaining that close balance in battleground status.
But is it 80%? What is our voter turnout?
Oh, I'm sorry. If you do it among people who are registered to vote, then it's up in the high 80s or even the low 90s. But if you do it of all people over 18, then it's a good deal less, because obviously if you're motivated to vote and you get registered, you have a pretty high likelihood of voting. But even if you use just a voting age population, we're still near the top in the country. Just a lower percentage because of folks that aren't registered. And some that are ineligible, like felons who are disenfranchised.
I just wanted to ask a question about Project 2025 and whether or not that's something that is planned to be asked about, and perception of that and how that adjusts what people vote.
The visibility of Project 2025 has been raised by mostly Democratic rhetoric about it, though maybe some by Trump's disavowals of having anything to do with it. We may ask about it if it continues to figure in the debate. The reluctance on my part is, what do people know is in that Project 2025 plan? Now, as I was getting off the freeway this morning, there's a billboard about Project 2025 with 3 policies that are contained in it. So clearly that people are advertising based on it. And so if it grows in visibility, I could ask about it. We have been asking about specific issues that, in this case, more Trump than Project 25, specifically deportations. When we asked the question in 2 different ways, I said earlier I'd get to this, so let me do it now. If you just ask, should the government deport all immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally, which is sort of Trump's phrasing of this, 61% favor that deportation policy. If you add to the end of the sentence, including those who have been here for a number of years, have jobs, and no criminal record, that drops into the mid-40s. So there's quite a gap there, not quite 20 points, between whether you just have a blunt statement with no qualifications or a statement that points out that you're not just talking about people currently arriving at the border. That's something that we might delve deeper into. I kind of prefer those kinds of specific issues over Project 2025 when most people have not read all 900 pages. I confess I have not either.
And in the minute we have left, could we go into Governor Evers' job approval? Because I know you asked in the poll.
Most popular guy in the state. Job approval still holding above 50%. Disapproval down in the mid 40s or so. This has been, excuse me, the sort of hallmark of Evers' administration. Almost always more approval than disapproval. I think that reversed maybe once in our polling. And since the 22 re-election, he's had these consistent approval numbers in the low to mid 50s. Not as high as the 65 and 70% at the beginning of COVID, where he, like a lot of governors, got a real bounce from addressing the pandemic. But he's maintained this above 50% mark for quite a while.
I wanted to get to it because we never have an opportunity.
Yes, the last slide, so we often have to jettison it.
Go ahead.
What is missing from your evaluation are what I consider two really major things. One, Pamela. I think she is being recognized and has a growing credibility and a growing recognition that she got her head screwed on right in a group of people that don't. And the second thing is, if I could read my own writing, abortion.
Yeah.
I think abortion is a major issue. I think it goes deeper than abortion itself. It includes women's rights. Women are starting to understand their power and are standing up.
Yeah, two things.
Therefore, I do not see it going as evenly as you.
Yeah. Two things. One is on those personality traits that we talked about, I think there you really do see she is in a better position. We'll see as she emerges, as she just has, how much that shifts, but I think those are real possibilities. It is notable that having been seen pretty negatively during much of her vice presidency, there's been this not enormous, but substantial movement to be more favorable to her. We'll see if that continues. Of course, she'll suffer the attacks from the Trump campaign making the counter argument. But that, I think, is a real place for some movement to take place. On abortion, on those who's better on abortion, her advantage over Trump is notably bigger than Biden's advantage over Trump. The possibility there is if she emphasizes that issue, which she's been doing in her rallies to a small extent, she could raise the salience of the issue over what Biden was doing and her own advantage on that issue. The fly in the ointment is that Democrats are incredibly united on the abortion issue. Over 90% favor abortion rights. But she has to not just preach to that choir. Among independents, 2/3 favor abortion rights, but they rank abortion low down as important to them. So does the campaign raise the salience of that issue if she emphasizes it more? Does Trump gather any right to life support that he may not already have if that happens? But I do think the chance here is she has a bigger advantage than Biden on that issue. But the folks she would most like to entice over are those independents who favor abortion rights, but who are not putting up high on their issue agenda. So I agree with you on both of those, that her personality and image becomes a big issue. We've seen a fast, strong rollout. We're going to see a DNC that tries to cement all of that. And what issue shift is there, with abortion being the most obvious one? So let me stop there. But I do think those are possibilities.
Can we give Dr. Franklin a round of applause, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. National poll tomorrow, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Shall I say it?
Please, please.
So tomorrow, just to confuse everybody, we're releasing a national poll. We don't normally do that. The national had been scheduled for this time because it's our review of the Supreme Court term. But of course, developments mean we're covering a lot of politics in it as well. This poll today was this unscheduled Wisconsin poll that we rushed in to do that because of events. So we do not normally release them back to back. We usually put a week at least between releases. But you will see a national poll from us tomorrow as well. So try not to confuse which is national and which is Wisconsin, because Twitter never makes that mistake.
Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to go out to the forum.